From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
I'm in a place called Talisman on the southern border of Mexico with Guatemala. We're on the Mexican side. It's mid-morning, it's really hot. We've been here since about 6 a.m. We're just watching as people carrying their bags, carrying their children, cross back over from Mexico to Guatemala. It's a really small border post in this really remote part of southern Mexico in the jungle, but it is one of the big conduits for people who are crossing back to Central and South America after having given up on the American dream.
After a historic surge of immigration across the US's southern border, with over 2 million people crossing or attempting to cross in 2024 alone, the roads north have now gone quiet. Since Donald Trump returned to office, hundreds of thousands of people have had to turn around and head back south. What does it mean for the idea of the United States, the land of immigrants, the melting pot? And how does it feel, having risked everything to travel north, to have to turn around? The story today, all quiet on Trump's southern border.
My name's Louise Callaghan, and I'm the US correspondent for the Sunday Times.
Louise, you've just returned from a fascinating reporting trip south of the US border. Where exactly did you go and why?
So I went to a town called Tapachula in southern Mexico in Chiapas, and it's right near the border with Guatemala. There's been so much focus on the northern Mexican border and the southern US border at the moment. And so I wanted to know what was happening on the southern Mexican border, the border with Guatemala, because that is the entry point to the route to the United States, where so many people over so many years have been flooding in.
And what was it like there?
It was amazing. It was incredibly quiet. I mean, this is a border that just a few months ago was being kind of overwhelmed by really large numbers of people who are crossing over in these inflatable rafts, trying to get to Mexico and then to carry on that long journey north to the US. So there's, I'd say, probably tens of thousands. At some stage, probably there were hundreds of thousands of migrants there. And I mean from all over the world, not just from Central America. You meet people there from Ghana, from Vietnam, from Mauritania. It's really kind of like the whole world is there and on its way north. And then now it's just it's incredibly quiet. And there's really large numbers of people who are trapped in limbo, who had been heading northwards, heading towards this American dream, and then found out that the border with the US had been closed. I went to the bus station in Tapachula, and it was fascinating. There's all these big signs everywhere advertising the routes going south. So you can get on a bus to El Salvador, you can get a bus to Honduras, all of these kind of countries to Guatemala. And then there was a discount on rides going north to the border city of Tijuana or to Ciudad Juarez. All the seats there were half price and available only to Mexican citizens.
And for this town that you were visiting, this is a huge difference. It's gone from being a staging post for thousands of migrants every year to just a place of limbo. What did the locals make of it?
So I spoke to a priest called Father Ayman Vasquez Medina, and he was fascinating. He'd been kind of operating this centre that migrants would stay in next to his church when they were passing through, and he'd give them a place to stay and give them food. And so he described the situation a year ago as having been like an invasion.
Suchate estaba invadido de migrantes. El parque estaba siempre lleno.
The park was full of migrants. You see this area here? It was full of migrants. Women, children, always full of migrants.
Ahí mujeres, niños, o sea, y todo estaba lleno de migrantes.
There were people from all over the world camped out everywhere in the town. And then now the numbers are just so much lower.
We had sometimes 500, 700, up to 800 people arriving here. And now sometimes it reaches 25, 30.
I mean, we were there for maybe a week and I don't think I met a single person crossing north. So Father Ayman was telling me about how because of the way that the numbers have dropped, then the road north to the US has actually become much more dangerous.
Yo veo que la migración se va a hacer más peligrosa y más costosa. Para el migrante, los coyotes le van a cobrar más.
Smugglers can charge you more because there's more surveillance. They're going to charge them more, and it's going to be more dangerous. Right now, there's hundreds, thousands of migrants that get kidnapped in this country, in Mexico. And now I think it's going to be even worse.
Aquí en el país, en México. Pues ahorita yo considero que va a ser peor.
So cartels, which already controlled many of the smuggling routes, have taken advantage of the fact that the numbers are dropping in order to try and extort more money from migrants. Yeah. So, for example, when you, like right around the corner from his church is a smuggler's route. They call it El Paso de Coyote. And that's where if you come over on a small boat from Guatemala, then smugglers might meet you on the other side and say, well, you can only come through here if you pay me. If you don't pay them, they kidnap you, they call your family, they try and extort money from them. You know, we've heard accounts of migrants being tortured, raped, even killed. So these kind of practices, the way in which the cartels have a stranglehold on the migration routes, the fact that crossing these areas legally is no longer really possible, then it's going to give the cartels much more power, is what he said.
This seems to be a response to the return of Donald Trump. Just standing back to set out the policies that he's introduced that have led to this complete change at the border.
So on day one of Trump's new administration, he slammed through a bunch of executive orders. I think probably the most important one was that he declared that there was an invasion going on of the United States, and that meant that he would have extraordinary measures to close the border. And by that, I mean, they mean a military invasion. You know, and this is not a sort of like a hypothetical idea of there being too many people coming in. They're saying it's literally an invasion. Then he took the, completely extraordinary step of completely cancelling the CBP-1 program. So that was a Biden-era program basically designed to reduce illegal border crossings while providing a way for people to seek asylum in the US. And the way it worked was that you could apply for an appointment to go and seek asylum at a specific time in a specific place on the US border. So all of these appointments were cancelled. So there's a CBP-1 appointments, there's the executive orders, and there's also just the fact that like Trump's incredibly bombastic and loud rhetoric has cut through. Across Latin America, people know Trump, he's going to close the border. And people understand that he's telling the truth, that this isn't, when Kamala Harris said it before, she said, don't come. I don't think that hit through at all because people were still hearing stories about family members who made it through. With Trump, I think people take it really seriously. So that's another part of it. Another part is that, so Mexico had already been stepping up enforcement inside the country to stop people traveling through northwards under pressure from the Biden administration. But I think they have increased that. And we saw that a bit in Tapachula and in the south. While they always had checkpoints going north, I think now they're probably being enforced more. So it's even harder for migrants to move through the country.
So lots of different reasons why suddenly it does look like the stream of people coming in is drying up. Take us back a couple of years, though, just to give a bit of context. How much had migrant crossings shot up under Joe Biden?
So when Biden came into office and there were loads of pandemic-era restrictions that existed on the southern border, Trump had essentially taken advantage of the fact that there was a pandemic in order to shut the border, as many countries did. Trump had a policy called Remain in Mexico, where you could, if you were seeking asylum in the US, you had to wait for your parole hearing on the Mexican side. Biden changed that. He repealed the Remain in Mexico program. And then when the pandemic era restrictions lifted, then people started flooding through again. And the numbers were really, really high. So in December 2023, I think it was 250,000 people were registered as encounters on the southern border. That's a term that the US Border Force uses to roughly measure the number of people trying to cross. Obviously, that's an incredibly large number of people to be trying to cross into your country in 1 month. Then, I think after that, there was these huge record numbers. Biden started panicking. It looked really bad for him politically. That's when he convinced Mexico to start enforcing more like the kind of interior of Mexico, to set up checkpoints to stop migrants crossing north. So Mexico started doing that. That cut the numbers pretty dramatically in sort of January, February 2024. Then came the summer of 2024. So last year, the numbers were still too high. An election was coming up. It was being fought largely on questions of immigration and the border. That was one of the big topics. Biden then slams down, some executive orders. He puts really a huge effort into trying to stop people crossing over the border. It worked. Numbers fell pretty dramatically. But, it was too little too late. But Trump was still completely able to run away with this message that the United States is being invaded by people and that Biden's doing nothing to stop it. So, the Trump administration's only been in power a month now. Numbers have fallen still further than they had been under the Biden administration. But I think it's really important to note that they had already been falling beforehand.
So they're already going down. They're going down even further now. Give us a sense in terms of numbers of just how dramatic that decline has been.
So this month, the Border Force just released the numbers yesterday. They registered 30,000 encounters on the border. So at the absolute peak in December 2023, I think the record was about 250,000 people. Encounters registered in 1 month, I think up to 300,000 maybe. And it's not only on the US border that the numbers have fallen, the numbers going into Mexico are way down. And also, so this is really, really crucial, the number of people who are crossing into Panama over the Darien Gap from Colombia has fallen really dramatically. The Panamanian government put out some figures last month where they're saying that there's been a 94% drop in the number of people trying to cross from Colombia into Panama in January 2025 compared to the same time last year. And then so in total, the international organizations and analysts that I spoke to, they think that about 200,000 people, give or take, mostly non-Mexican, were trapped in limbo on the way to the US when these border restrictions came in. So I really wanted to find out the human stories behind this. The people who risked everything, in many cases, sold their houses, sold everything they had to try and come to the US, and then were caught in limbo on the way.
Louise, you were saying that you wanted to speak to some of the people who had lived this experience, who'd made the difficult journey to the border and were now going to have to turn around, often travelling thousands of miles back. Tell us about some of the people you met there.
So I met this amazing woman called Andrea. She's about 35 years old. She's an accountant. She's got a 9-year-old son, and she is from Peru.
Okay, ¿naciste en Perú? Sí, yo nací en Perú y cuando tenía 5 años mi mamá me llevó a vivir a Venezuela.
So Andrea, she was born in Lima, but she grew up in Venezuela. She has a Venezuelan husband. And about, I think it was in October, she decided to go to the US. The situation in Venezuela was just completely untenable. There's been an extraordinary economic crisis there, great instability. And so because her husband didn't have a Peruvian passport and couldn't go with her to Peru, they would decide to try and go to the US. She has family there. She has a sister in San Francisco. She thought that they'd be able to find a better life there. So she and her son, who both have Peruvian passports, they flew to Costa Rica and then waited for her husband, who, because he had a Venezuelan passport, where you need a visa to enter Costa Rica. Then he did this terrible, terrible journey through the Darien Gap.
Pasar la selva del Dairén. Él pasó la selva solo. Sí.
Tell us about the Darien Gap.
So the Darien Gap is a jungle that kind of runs from Colombia over to Panama. And the route through there, you have to go through there. It's like a bottleneck. If you want to go from South America through Central America into the United States, you have to go through there. And it is the part of the road to the US that migrants dread the most. The Darien Gap is controlled by cartels. And the road itself is also just very dangerous. It's this kind of paths through the jungle where you have to climb, you have to wade through rivers. It's incredibly dangerous just kind of in terms of the landscape. You know, people fall all the time, they die, they're also killed by cartels. Almost everyone I speak to who's gone through the Darien Gap tells me that they walk past the bodies of dead migrants on the way.
How horrific.
You know, it's an unbelievably dangerous, it's horrifying, and it's an unbelievably dangerous route. So people really only do take it if they're absolutely desperate. So that's the way that Andrea's husband took. He made it, and then he met them in Costa Rica, and they made it all the way north to Mexico. As they were crossing the river from Guatemala into Mexico, they were stopped by the cartels. They could see Mexico in front of them, Andrea was telling me, and then she saw some people waiting on that bank. They got off, and the cartel members said, before you go any further, you have to pay us. They were asking for, I think it was a few $100s each. And they didn't have it all. So because they didn't have it, they were kidnapped by the cartels. They call it an express kidnapping in Mexico.
What does that mean?
It means that they kidnap you, call your family, and try and get money quickly by, you know, putting pressure on your family. Or, you know, they say that they're going to beat you, they say that they're going to rape you if you're a woman. This is something that they talk about a lot. There's a huge threats of sexual violence constantly against women on the migrant route. And then so they call your family and they threaten you on the phone. And then if your family don't send money, it's within a very short period of time, a few hours, then that's when things get worse. That's when you start getting moved elsewhere. That's when you start getting beaten. I mean, we've heard of people who are taken for express kidnappings and were released after a few hours. There's also people who were released after 7 months.
Oh, God.
You know, it's really, it can go either way. But what was amazing, actually, what Andrea told me, is that they had almost enough money with them. They were just missing, I think it was $50, you know, which would have made the difference in between life and death. And then one of the cartel members kind of took to her. You know, it's just strange how these things happen. And he said, look, you need to lie and say that your son is under 7 years old. Gustavo, her son, is 9, but he said lie and say he's under 7.
Entonces hablamos con una persona que era la persona que cobraba, aparte que era de la mafia, pero era una persona.
Because then we do a discount for children. And that's how she managed to get out. You know, unbelievable. So yeah, she said, look, he's 7 years old. And they said, oh, okay, we'll let you off for that extra $50.
Yo te voy a recibir 260, pero tú vas a decir que el niño tiene.
So she made it out after a few hours, which is amazingly lucky. A lot of people don't.
It's incredibly lucky.
Yeah, no, it's crazy the way that, you know, these really small things can kind of change the future of your life.
So they managed to get to Mexico. What happens there?
When they were there, then they applied for the CBP-1 appointment, which is, you know, the kind of legal pathway by which you try and cross into the US to claim asylum. And then so they received that. They got a meeting for the CBP-1 at February the 4th at 7 a.m. Then they were waiting for permission to cross north from the Mexican authorities. And that's when Trump took office. So on January the 20th, then they just got a message saying that your appointment's been cancelled.
What do they do?
I think at first they were just in shock. They just couldn't believe it. I think it sounds strange in retrospect, but so many of the people that I spoke to believed that if you had an appointment, even if it was for after January the 20th, you'd still be able to cross. They didn't think that Trump would cancel the existing appointments, but he did. So Andrea was faced with this horrible choice. Her husband, with his Venezuelan passport, basically couldn't go anywhere. There's been this huge number of refugees and migrants leaving Venezuela over the last few years due to the terrible economic and political crisis. They're not welcome in most of Latin America. So she had to make a terrible choice. She had to decide whether her and her son, who both had Peruvian passports, were going to take the voluntary repatriation flights back to Peru and leave her husband behind, or whether they were going to try and stay and make a life in Mexico. In the end, I think she looked into how difficult it would be to get her son into school, to how difficult it would be to her to find work as an accountant. And they realized they were going to have to split their family up. So now in March, Andrea and Gustavo are going to go back to Peru, and her husband's going to have to stay there. And it's terrible. It's just such an appalling situation for this family in particular. I was sitting with her on a park bench in Tapachula, and she was crying. I think, she is going to have to start from zero. She has a Peruvian passport, which is, in some ways she's lucky. In a terrible way, she kind of is. She's with a Peruvian passport, she can go home, she can try and find a job there, but she doesn't have anything or anyone in Peru. She grew up in Venezuela. So it's very much she's going to be starting from zero. Her son's going to be starting from zero, and she's going to have to leave her husband behind.
That's horrific. And her husband has to try and make the best of it in Mexico. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. He doesn't really have any other option. Also, the Venezuelan government does not look kindly on people who fled and tried to return. There's every chance that if he did go back, he could be arrested, he could be tortured. This is something that there's a huge amount of fear from a lot of the people that I spoke to from Venezuela about what might happen to them if they go back.
Louise, that story is obviously utterly devastating for the family in the middle of it. In a way, though, for a lot of Americans will look at that and say, this is exactly why they voted for Donald Trump. This is what he campaigned on. These were the policies he said he'd introduce, and now he's introduced them. Is this the Trump agenda already making itself felt? Is this a success for him?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's no denying it. Trump's gone around for the last 4 years saying, if I win, I'm going to immediately shut down the border. I'm going to declare an invasion. I'm going to stop all this happening again. Yeah, and he's done it. Sure, absolutely. No one is denying that. And I think with his polling numbers, it's clear that a lot of Americans really back him. At the moment, it's a lot of splashy headlines. I think for a lot of American news consumers, a lot of American voters, what they're going to have been seeing is these big top line things, Mexico sending 10,000 more National Guard to the border. They're going to see the border shut down. Numbers of arrivals are way down. I mean, I don't particularly understand whether this is legal or not.
Tell us about that, because it may be popular, it may be winning him support from voters, but as you mentioned earlier, a lot of this is being done in a state of emergency, as if they're at war. Is it legal?
So I was speaking to some immigration scholars yesterday, and it's really not clear. I think if this is this idea that there's an invasion, which is what the executive orders blocking the border are predicated on, if they're tested in the courts, I think it's pretty unlikely that that's going to stand up. This is not a military invasion of the United States, clearly. So is that going to be legal? I mean, at the moment, there is basically no effective way to seek asylum in the US by crossing over the border and seeking asylum. If you're already in the US, I suppose you probably can. But it's all still really unclear. And even, the people whose job it is, like immigration lawyers who work on the border, who understand this policy, they say that we're just still in a bit of a kind of shadow land. Like, we don't really understand what's going on. We don't really understand whether it's legal. So I think once these claims get tested in the courts, these executive orders get tested in the courts, then we might see how it shakes out. But it's also, there's also the question of how this impacts the US and how long you can keep people from coming in.
There is a sense, I suppose, that it may be what voters and Trump supporters want, but be careful what you wish for. I mean, how will this affect the US economy?
Right. I mean, this is a huge question. Half of US agricultural workers are undocumented. And that's a conservative estimate, right? And this is the world's biggest economy. What happens if they're all afraid to go to work? What happens if they go home? I mean, especially what happens in Florida, one of the big agricultural states, which is a red state, which voted overwhelmingly for Trump. What happens when you can't get enough people to, pick your tomatoes or, pick your oranges? Food prices spike. It hits ordinary people's pockets. I mean, this is, and this is not like an apocalyptic scenario that I'm painting. This is just what's going to happen if you do the policies as outlined by Trump's people. I mean, you want to try and deport all the people who are here illegally, you're going to have to find some other people to run your farms. That's just the kind of reality of it. And then if that's not done smoothly, if that doesn't go well, yeah, there could be huge shocks of food prices. Absolutely.
I should say we're already hearing from listeners to the podcast in America in Texas, who sort of say that they're noticing this with agricultural businesses. It's already becoming a problem. Louise, just standing back, for many people, America and what it represents, this great land of opportunity, a land of immigrants, Statue of Liberty, does that fundamentally change? Does it change the character of the country?
I think when you listen to what the people around Trump are saying now about what they believe the United States is, it sounds very different from what we might have grown up hearing about the US. But the way that the people around Trump talk about the kind of vision for America that they want, it's a very nativist idea. I was talking to Steve Bannon, who's one of his close advisors, now from outside the White House, a few months ago. And he was painting this picture about what he believed was the future for America. And it's a very multi-ethnic, working class, populist coalition of Americans. And that means, people with US citizenship who will create this working class movement that will kind of rise up and destroy the elites. That's how they see it. But what they do not see is this version of the US where all the best people from all over the world move to America to try and make it the greatest country in the world, all the greatest engineers in India and all the, all the best kind of artists or singers of South Africa to anywhere, they don't see that. They don't see this idea that America is this a huge land of opportunity for anyone who wants to come and work really hard and change their life. They're saying that this is America for the people who are already Americans, for the people who are already here.
Louise Callaghan, US correspondent for The Sunday Times. You can read her full dispatch from the border at thetimes.com. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Edward Drummond, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you have any thoughts on what you've just heard, do send us an email to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.